Welcome, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the October webinar for the Lake States Fire Science Consortium. I'm Jack McGowan-Stinsky, and I will be moderating the webinar this afternoon. This webinar also kicks off our 2016-2017 webinar series. We have one per month through April 2017. For those who may be joining us for the first time, let me give you a little background. We are funded by the Joint Fire Science Program and are one of 15 regional consortia for fire science exchanges across the country. Our mission is to accelerate the awareness, understanding, adoption, and sharing of wildland fire science information by federal, tribal, state, local, and private stakeholders across the Lake States and the adjacent Canadian provinces of Ontario and Manitoba. We strive to be inclusive and neutral science partners, working to foster collaboration among researchers and practitioners and organizations and individuals, and by developing innovative approaches to achieve science delivery while facilitating dialogue about new science findings and emerging needs. Before we get started, let's take a few seconds and look at our Adobe Connect webinar interface. To ask a question or interact with the attendees, please use the chat box located in the lower right-hand portion of your screen. Once you type your question, make sure you click the send button. We'll be monitoring these questions and we'll make sure that there's an opportunity to address them. If you'd like to learn more about the consortium and what we are doing, please visit our website at lakestatesfiresci.net. Please sign up to receive our newsletters and announcements of other activities, and you can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. We also ask that you please take a short evaluation survey after the webinar. The evaluation has only 4 questions and will help us assess this webinar and any improvements we can make in future webinars. When the webinar ends, the evaluation should pop up. If not, the link is also available in the chat box that you can copy and complete it. Now on to today's webinar, Good Fences, Good Neighbors, Coordination Across Property Boundaries Among Private Landowners by Paige Fischer. Paige is an assistant professor at the School of Natural Resources and Environment at the University of Michigan. Paige's research group focuses on human dimensions of environmental change in forest ecosystems. The primary goal of her research is to increase scientific understanding of human behavior as it relates to the sustainability of socio-ecological systems. Paige investigates factors that enable and constrain human adaptation to environmental change, including natural hazards and climate-related changes. She is particularly interested in understanding the capacity of individuals, such as private landowners and organizations, to adapt to environmental change through individual and collective natural resource management and environmental conservation actions. Paige draws on theories from the fields of natural resource sociology and human geography. Her methods include qualitative interview analysis, quantitative survey analysis, and social network analysis. Paige collaborates with researchers from diverse disciplines using a broad range of analytical approaches and strives to address problems of concern to local practitioners. So with that, let's get to the webinar. Take it away, Paige.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. And it's great to have this opportunity to share some results from some recent research. Again, the title of my presentation is Good Fences, Good Neighbors. That's a question mark. Coordination across property boundaries among private landowners. I should mention a couple things about a couple more things about me before I begin, because there's a little bit of a history to this research that I'm going to be sharing with you today. So I came to University of Michigan from the Pacific Northwest, where I was a research social scientist at the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station. And I also come from a family that owns forest land. And when I was in Oregon, I did a lot of research on private forest landowners and what motivates them and enables and constrains them from engaging in different management practices. And so all along, I've been very interested in private landowners, how they manage specifically ecological problems that aren't restricted to individual properties like wildfire and invasive plants and diseases, and also what enables them to think on broader scales and manage on broader scales. This project is a piece of that overall kind of line of research that I've been involved in. And I should also mention it's a piece of a broader study of coordinated management or cross-boundary cooperation on forest management in mixed ownership landscapes, specifically in fire-prone forest landscapes. And that's a study that Susan Charnley of the Pacific Northwest Research Station and Erin Kelly at Humboldt State University are also working on. My piece is looking at the coordination among private landowners, but the overall study is looking at coordination and cross-boundary landscape management among all sorts of owners. And what I'm going to be presenting today is the preliminary results from a portion of the research that I'm doing on the topic of coordination among coordination across property boundaries among private landowners. It's the results from the research I've been doing with 2 students in the lake states of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. Although I am also doing research, the same exact research in the Pacific Northwest, specifically Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. And so what I'm going to be talking about today are the results of preliminary results from work that we did using a qualitative case study approach, and I'll explain what that means, to investigate coordinated management among private non-industrial landowners, so families, individuals, in the lake states. The goals were to characterize the ways to find out, first of all, whether there's any evidence that landowners are coordinating, so jointly planning, funding, implementing management practices across ownership boundaries, to characterize how they're doing that, and then to identify factors that led to their decisions to do that, and their ability to keep coordinating over time. So that's the introduction. I want to. Oh, and I should have moved to my introductory slide here. And so there's my introductory slide, and I want to acknowledge the other research team members, Andrew Klooster and Laura Siragiri from the University of Michigan, 2 students who worked with me closely on this, and then also the funding sources, the McIntyre Stennis program from the National Institute of Food and Agriculture and the Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station and the National Fire Plan. So a little bit of background about kind of the broader context that motivated this study, and that has to do with the need for landscape management and the fact that wildfire and other stressors, threats, changes are occurring in forest ecosystems, and that many of these stressors operate on larger scales than the typical parcel. And this is true in many forest systems across the world, across the United States, but also especially in the lake states where climate models, and it's probably going to be increasingly true in the lake states where climate models are projecting hotter and more arid conditions and other kinds of climate conditions that may result in larger wildfires, more invasive plants, pests, and pathogens, and heat and drought stress, and severe weather events, things that affect forests or can affect forests on large scales through tree mortality and vegetation change. And there's a fair amount of policy emphasis on that acknowledges the landscape scale of many of these forest management challenges, and for wildfire risk in particular. So just a couple examples: the Department of Interior's landscape conservation cooperatives are institutional innovations to enable landscape scale planning among multiple ownership groups, and then also more recently the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Joint Chiefs Landscape Restoration Partnership between the Forest Service and the Natural Resource Conservation Service is trying to support cross-boundary cooperation on planning and management between public and private landowners. And then another example is the Wyden Amendment, which allows the Forest Service to enter into cooperative agreements around management on national forests and with private land neighbors. So why am I focusing on private forest owners in particular and coordinated management among private forest owners in particular? Well, there's a few reasons that make this an especially important population in the lake states, but also nationwide. They own, this group of landowners, which includes individuals and families, own large proportions of forest land, over half in some states, almost half in Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota, and of forest land. And their holdings are mostly in small parcels. So it's a lot of different owners managing a lot of different pieces of land, and they manage for a wide variety of objectives, not just a financial investment in timber or land value or managing a home site. Many manage for recreation, biodiversity, and scenery. So there's a large diversity in management approaches and management goals. But because they are small, the economy of scale may be limited for some of their management practices. And so coordination and pooling funds, pooling labor, pooling time could arguably increase the scale and impact of their management practices and reduce the cost. So these are some of the reasons we were interested in this particular ownership group. So a little bit more about coordinated management and what I'm talking about. So I already mentioned that for me, coordinated management is jointly planning, funding, implementing management actions. But coordination is also, coordinated forest management is an example of the larger idea of cooperation among people. So this gets into some of my, what goes around in my head as an academic. And so cooperation is based on the idea of that people benefit from reciprocating with others, and especially when the combined efforts that people put into something through cooperation can achieve more than individual efforts, right? There's only so much time and effort that we can put into things as individuals, and we have to be selective on who we cooperate with, and so there has to be some benefit to us of interacting with others. But engaging in social exchanges, so jointly planning, jointly managing, in some cases can generate both benefits but also obligations. So if I share information with you or resources with you, or or invest in forest management practices on my land that benefit you, there may be some expectations. So it can be a little bit dicey social territory when you start coordinating around management, especially because because in many cases forest management does involve heavy investments in time and labor and equipment and things like that. So sometimes there are risks when people get involved in relationships that are kind of an economic nature. So sharing equipment, sharing time that could be spent doing other things, sharing resources that people have worked hard to accumulate. And there's some concern that without formal agreements among people, that some people will put more in than others, and so they'll get taken advantage of. And so there's a lot of questions about kind of from the world of research and academia is what makes it worthwhile to cooperate as individuals. And there's also concerns or interest in this in the policy world. How do we design policies and plans and programs that make it worthwhile for people to cooperate? So our questions were to look at this in the important context of fire-prone forests and private landowners. So first of all, we wanted to know how and whether landowners coordinate management, and then what factors contribute to their decisions to manage, so the emergence of coordinated management among landowners, and the success. And really what I mean by that is the ongoing coordination, that it's not just a one-time thing. And then what is the functional role of coordinated management? And what I mean by that is, what purpose does it serve? What are some of the outcomes? And then finally, what policies or programs or decisions, and what I'm calling institutional interventions, may be needed to help private owners coordinate to attain the ecological and economic benefits of managing in cooperation with others. So those are our questions. In terms of methods, we used a comparative approach where we identified cases. It sounds like my audio is not that great, so I'm going to try to talk a little bit more clearly, but let me know if it does not continue, if it doesn't get better. So, we identified cases in which, okay, so you know what? I'm going to change to away from my headset because that could be an issue. So hold on one second. Okay, let me know if this is better. Let's see. Okay, well, I'm getting messages that the audio is not good, but now I'm on my phone. So let me know if this is better. So in terms of methods, we identified cases in which landowners were coordinating by planning or implementing management. And then we interviewed the landowners who were involved in those, and then we analyzed those interviews using an approach called qualitative content analysis to identify key themes. And I have maps here of the Lake States and the Pacific Northwest, so you have an idea of the general geographic scope, but really today we're just talking about the results from the Lake States. So, and there were 4 cases in the Lake States, and here I am using pseudonyms to refer to these cases, although the landowners in many cases refer to themselves using a formal name. So, so there are 4 cases here, one in southeast Michigan that involved 10 landowners that were adjacent that collectively own about 600 acres. And their goals were restoration of invasive plants, but also restoration using fire. Another example from northern Minnesota, where there were 26 landowners with smaller sized parcels who were specifically trying to address the risk of wildfire. Another from southeast Wisconsin, where there were a larger number of landowners spread out over a much broader geographic area that generally owned parcels more closer to the 100-acre size, but some of them were smaller. And they were aiming to manage for restoration and invasive plant mitigation, and primarily using prescribed fire. And so in this particular case, they were trained in prescribed fire use, and they all were part of a network, an informal network of people who lived in kind of the general geographic area vicinity, and they were all part of an email group, and so when one person wanted to burn, they could send out the message, and then others who were participated in that network of trained prescribed burners could go out and help them for a day. And then finally, this one, Perry Lake, it's supposed to actually say northern Minnesota, not Michigan. That was 12 landowners with much smaller parcel sizes, and they also owned a common area, and they were managing the common area, which was much larger, that was more tens of acres, along with their individual parcels to address the risk of fire. So those are the 4 cases, and then I have all the other cases, which are from the West, marked out because I hadn't gotten around to creating pseudonyms yet. But those other cases will be in our study. So here's a little overview of the ways that they coordinated. We divided the different ways that they coordinated into two categories. One was joint planning, and the other is joint implementation of forest management activities. So joint planning was really the most common way that landowners coordinated, mainly through informal coordination at social events like neighborhood potlucks and kind of impromptu meetings. In some of the cases, landowners communicated more formally through formal meetings as a group that coordinated management, or as a homeowners association with a function of coordinating forest management. Some of them had email lists and newsletters. Some of them also, 3 of them coordinated on fundraising, so submitting grant proposals. And then on the joint implementation side, in 2 of the cases, landowners shared equipment. So, for example, sharing a tractor or a bulldozer or other kinds of thinning equipment. In 3 of the cases, landowners shared labor by hiring a crew or hiring individuals to work on their property, and they went in on hiring those individuals or that crew together. So they shared labor in that way. And in 2 of the cases, the landowners actually pooled their own labor by working side by side on their properties, by pulling invasives and using prescribed fire and thinning hazardous fuel. So in terms of the factors that we identified as main contributors to the emergence of coordinated management among the landowners and the success, so the kind of ongoing nature of the coordination, there were a number of them. But in this table, we presented the ones that were named by at least 2, identified in at least 2 of these cases. So the most common one was, so I'm just going to identify all of these, and I'm going to provide some examples in the next couple of slides. So here, the most common ones were having a shared interest or concern or perception of risk, also having a strong leader within the group, access to outside information, being part of a cohesive social group, either a community of place or a community of interest, having access to expertise within the group, access to funding, and already having some sort of formal institution that they were part of, so like a homeowners association. And then also in 2 of the cases, landowners really identified the fact that they lived in the area as opposed to being seasonal or absentee landowners as being a really key factor. So in some of the cases, these factors both contributed to the decision to coordinate and the ongoing nature of the coordination. In other cases, landowners felt like it contributed to either one or the other, the initial decision or the ongoing nature of the coordination. So just for an example, in terms of shared risk, this was the most common one, and it was mentioned by all landowners as a really important factor in the emergence and the success of coordinated management. And one landowner said, given our overall environment and being locked in with only really one good ingress, egress, in the event of a forest fire, it was going to take all of us trying to work together. And so the fact that all the landowners felt very exposed to wildfire risk because of their kind of physical situation, it really compelled them to work together. In other cases, a strong leader was important, so you have to have someone who keeps it going, to keeps it organized, keeps people interested. If it wasn't for this guy, Don, in one of the cases, this whole effort would have dissolved. So having somebody from within the group of landowners really step up and lead the effort was key. Access to information outside the group. It was Mark at DNR who first brought us together. DNR came out and helped us assess the situation, and the direction they provided for the initial work is what got us started. So having that kind of outside impetus was really key for the emergence of coordination, but and also in some of the cases, kind of having that individual or that organization available also helped landowners continue to coordinate. This issue of social cohesion was a really interesting one. So one landowner said we had a loose-knit organization to begin with. So to address common causes like roads, plowing, gates, and things like that, we were historically used to doing some things in common. So when someone said fire is an important issue, we were able to organize around it. So that was really interesting, the fact that people talking about already having some sort of pattern of social interaction or some sort of sense of community that had already created the trust and familiarity made it easier for them to start engaging in this coordinated planning and management. Similarly, a landowner said there were social relationships that were already in place. We had trust in one of the leaders, Bill, and trust in each other, and nobody was trying to skim any money out of this, only putting money in. So they were very much motivated by altruistic goals, and that in part was because they felt like what they did was going to benefit everybody. So in terms of the functional role, so this is what people saw as the outcomes or the benefits or the reasons why they invested their time and energy and in some cases resources and coordination. There were a number of interesting roles that were identified. So one of the most commonly identified one was that coordination actually increases the management skills of the landowners through learning. They learn from each other. It reduces the financial cost of management, which is one thing we were wondering about going into it. It seemed like coordination would do that, and indeed landowners felt like by pooling resources and labor that it indeed reduced the financial cost of management, perhaps by increasing the economy of scale. Landowners also said that coordination increased access to information about management. And by interacting with others and having a chance to talk to others, they learned more and they found out about more resources. Another interesting thing that landowners said is that it inspired self-confidence in management. So by coordinating and learning and having a chance to work with others, they started realizing they actually had a lot of capacity to do the work. So that whole social process of coordination made people feel more confident in their management practices and probably gave them the skills and to increase their confidence. Then there was also the issue of reducing the physical burden of management. So, going out and prescribe burning on 300 acres of your property, especially if you're working full time or maybe you're retired, that's a very challenging physical work. And so being able to call on neighbors or others in your network helped reduce the physical burden, which in some ways may have been a unsurmountable obstacle to managing land, and increase the access to funding. So forming a group of landowners and then working with an organization to submit a grant proposal was something that people wouldn't have done if they hadn't been coordinating with others, if they were just operating completely alone. And then some landowners mentioned how coordination also encouraged kind of a broader agreement on management standards. And so the more landowners interacted and and in some cases worked side by side, the more they came to learn about and agree on standards for management and then adopted those standards. So, and then some landowners also said that they wouldn't have been able to treat as large of an area if they hadn't been coordinating, especially with prescribed burning and pulling invasives and thinning hazardous fuel. And then some landowners also asserted that they ended up with improved ecological conditions as a result of being able to coordinate with others. And of course, we had no way of measuring that, and we didn't try to, but this is what landowners said. So here's a quote that I think captures a number of those, and this is from one of the landowners that was involved in the network of folks who had training in prescribed burning. We are able to accomplish a lot. It gives you a real boost when you go out with a group and get a whole section cleared or a whole area burned. That's a real boost psychologically. And the learning component. I was complaining about having to return my saw because it gets so dull. And someone said, no, you don't. He showed me how to sharpen my saw and where to buy a saw set and file. Now I have a setup for sharpening my saw. So that was just, one small example. But it's only through coordinating with others and interacting with others that, you realize kind of new techniques or technologies or ways of doing things that landowners weren't aware of before. So these little things all add up, though, over time. So those were some of the kind of the upshot of what came out of this initial work that we've done in the Lake States. And of course, as I mentioned, we're doing similar work in the Pacific Northwest, and we have more work to do in the Pacific Northwest. But based on those findings so far, I wanted to kind of return to some of these questions, especially this issue of how much coordination and the risks, the social risks that it entails, is a barrier to coordinated management. I think a lot of people, when I first started, the ways we identified these cases is just by calling natural resource professional after natural resource professional. And we contacted hundreds of people to try to identify these, dozen cases that we're looking at. And in many times, people assumed or weren't aware of any cases of coordinated management and assumed landowners really don't, because they don't want to get involved in each other's business. Private property is really important. It takes time and energy, and what are the benefits? So, but I think one thing we learned from this is that, well, it actually does happen. It may not be common at all, but it does happen, and in some cases, landowners find it beneficial. And although they acknowledge that there are some social risks, there are things that offset those social risks. And the things that offset those social risks were high levels of trust among landowners, mutually understood expectations, low expectation and demands from each other, so not expecting too much from each other, recognizing that people have other things to do, other priorities, and then also respect for individual autonomy. And here's two quotes that kind of illustrate these ideas. So one person who was a member of that group of landowners who were all trained in prescribed burning said, we still go out and help other people even though we don't ask other people to come help us anymore. I don't ever get the feeling that anybody's concerned about non-reciprocation. I've never heard anybody say, oh, they're always asking for help with a burn, but you never see them coming out to help. At our age, we don't get bent out of shape over that. And I think that what this person was saying, given our experience, we don't get bent out of shape. They had really developed the skills and the social network that they could keep on relying on each other. And if there were a few people who really mainly took rather than giving, that larger social network was able to absorb that, because there was enough people in there who were benefiting enough that it really wasn't a big issue if some people didn't reciprocate. The benefits overall for the good of the group outweighed that problem. And another landowner said, it's expectations, it's common courtesy. If I borrow a tractor, I'm not going to run a full tank of diesel full through it and return it to them. I'm going to fill it back up. Plus, I've kind of become a maintenance guy for some of them. I can weld, and I have an electrical license and mechanical contractor's license. So this landowner was talking about how people had kind of norms of being respectful, and that was a really important thing that made these cooperative efforts function, and that everybody, and in these cases where landowners were effectively or successfully coordinating, people were each bringing something to the effort, some sort of skill, some sort of resource, and so that made things work out. So one of the questions that we were interested in is, well, if it's kind of risky entering into these coordinated management arrangements where you are investing time, money, equipment, is it risky to not have some sort of formal agreement? And I think that people did recognize there were some limitations of not having formal agreements or being part of a formal organization or being part of a program. I should mention none of these folks were in these Joint Chiefs, were part of these Joint Chiefs programs. None of them had memorandums of understanding. with any other organizations that I know of. So they really weren't comprising formal institutions. But some of the landowners mentioned that there were some drawbacks of not having things more formal. Not being part of a formal organization made it difficult for in some people's views, to engage new seasonal residents, because they were kind of this informal group, and it was maybe hard for other people in the area to find out about them. There's also an issue of labor pools, the fact that people were aging and not necessarily bringing in new people because they didn't really have a formal organization with the ability to do outreach and recruit new people. Also, not being part of a formal organization made it difficult to apply for funding. And also, it made it difficult to maintain people's motivation and engagement. It took a lot of work to keep these things going, especially a lot of work on the part of the informal leader of the group of landowners. So one landowner said, there's something wonderful about an organization that's decided not to get really formal, but of course then you put yourself at risk of the ebb and flow of human energies. So, and we're aging, so and they were implying that it's hard to keep things going. And another said, we're a loose social group. When we originally started, almost everyone would show for our meetings, but houses turn over, new people come in, and the 10 of us or so that are involved with everything, we're the bad guys, so to speak. So when you don't have a formal organization, you just have this kind of small group of people who are really going to make things happen. They constantly have to be out there reminding people, this is about how important it is that they stay involved. And that's a burden for people. So there's some recognition of limitations of not having a formal organization, with a coordinator or some sort of structure. And they recognize the benefits of more formalized process, especially for funding and maintaining leadership and kind of organizing the coordination. And there was some concern about demanding too much but there was some concern about demanding too much of people if they did formalize. So one of the landowners said opportunities for grants would increase. You would have more participation and more property owners. But expecting someone to do that on their own time continually is not going to work. I put my heart into the stuff for years and finally just had to step back because I was doing too much. So it's very difficult for one person to keep things going. At the same time, somebody says, yeah, nobody keeps track of what you do. In fact, that is probably one reason we like it. It's very loose. It's very unstructured. And if you don't go to one of the meetings in the year, half the time they won't know you hadn't been there because nobody's keeping count. And that freedom and the lack of expectations and the possibility for letting people down was important because people have other things to do. They have other priorities. So people recognized, the benefits of institutions, but also recognized the benefits of not having them. So, of course, that's not really clear indication, okay, what are the policy implications? But there are a few things that we can take away. And again, this is an early stage where we're just finished with one region and we have more to go, and there's a lot more cross-case comparison and synthesis to do. But one thing that we learned is that coordinated management does occur among private landowners. It may be rare, but we've found numerous examples of it. And that's the social risks of engaging with your neighbors and crossing over fence lines and sharing, putting work into benefiting another landowner by reducing fuel on your side of the fence is going to reduce the risk of a fire on that landowner's side of the fence and vice versa. Although that's beneficial, getting involved in your neighbor's business can be problematic for all the reasons I talked about, but that's not a deal breaker for coordinated management, or it doesn't have to be, because we found examples where people were engaged in what could be considered risky social relationships, yet they were successfully coordinating, and they found that there were benefits from doing so. But at the same time, there are potentially some institutional innovations, so policies, tools, decisions, plans that could foster the social conditions that enable coordinated management. So There could be, if in certain areas that are considered high priority for, let's say, wildfire risk, creating a shared risk perception would be an important step in trying to foster coordinated management if that's a goal of an agency or of a group of local landowners. Building leadership and supporting leadership within a group of landowners is going to be very important. Providing some sort of access to outside expertise, either the landowners reaching out to an organization or organizations making landowners aware that they're available and can provide expertise is important. And then creating opportunities for to build social cohesion and social networks that foster trust and mutual understanding that help make coordination easier is also important. At the same time, any of these institutional innovations would need to accommodate some really basic some basic values, and one is that landowners really that we talked to appreciated others not expecting the world of them. They had a preference for having low expectation and demands of each other, keeping things informal, and a need for respecting people's individual autonomy. And so those would be two things to keep in mind in any effort to try to encourage or reward or enable coordinated management among private landowners by initiatives like Joint Chiefs initiatives or initiatives within LCCs or other kinds of policies or programs. So just to wrap up here, so our next steps are to finish our case studies in Oregon and Northern California. So we have more to go with this over the next year. And then compare and contrast all the cases and within and across the two regions, and then distill the findings into a framework to guide managers or practitioners or organizations and to inform policy and planning that's trying to encourage or make it more possible for landowners to coordinate management to achieve goals on larger spatial scales. And then, of course, writing a report so that we can share our findings with people, and then doing presentations and for the more of the research community journal articles. So that is the end of my presentation, and I really I look forward and would love to hear any of feedback, recommendations for how to proceed, questions, etc.
Hi, everybody. This is Jack. Yeah, please type any questions you have in the chat box. And thank you, Paige. Paige, I want to address something, and this is thinking about safety for private landowners. And I don't know how many folks paid attention in the September newsletter, but when we posted the announcement for this, we used a picture that showed two individuals doing a prescribed burn, but they did not have nomex on. They had gloves, and it looked like probably cotton clothing, but they didn't have any other safety gear. And I actually got a number of questions about that email directly to me where folks were saying, gee, that's not real professional. They expected more out of the Fire Science Consortium to promote that. And my response back was, well, we try to stay inclusive and neutral. And I think it's good that people caught that with the picture, because the picture says a lot, and I'd like to hear kind of your thought process on landowners and thinking about safety, whether it's herbicide treatment or special prescribed fire.
Yeah, well, I didn't have much of a thought process about that. We weren't out there working side by side with landowners, and that wasn't something that was on my radar screen. Thinking, evaluating safety. But it is an interesting, that insight, I guess, maybe implies an opportunity that, here we have landowners who are actively managing their lands in a coordinated fashion using some pretty advanced tools, the tools that that require safety precautions, and maybe the fact that they're doing that, what it shows is that landowners may be doing them in different communities with different norms about safety, or that landowners may be implementing these practices without communicating with people that consider themselves the experts or consider themselves having more understanding of safety considerations. So I guess one thing is that it opens up the question of what kinds of resources or information should landowners be made aware of so that they can engage in these practices with as much safety consideration as possible. I also see I see that Lisa Brush is participating, and I wonder if she might have some thoughts on this, because I know her organization has worked closely with landowners who have used prescribed fire as a management tool.
and that's really good. I was going to ask Lisa very similar, because, and this leads kind of into the second thought I had, which is, and jumping off the thinking about safety for private landowners, there may be many private landowners who would use the proper equipment, but they don't know where they can get it. They certainly don't have the finances to get it all. So it's more thinking about how do you share that expertise on one hand, and then also maybe getting that equipment. So thinking about the expertise, where do you have access to that expertise? Short list I came up with, thinking especially Michigan oriented, but in other areas, I mean, you have your extension offices, you have a variety of non-governmental agencies like the Nature Conservancy or other local nature conservancies, nature centers. You certainly have the Michigan Stewardship Network, and we'll see what Lisa can type up here. You also have volunteer opportunities through Michigan DNR. You have Forest Service, fishing officers. They often have a lot of volunteer opportunities where a private landowner could go and kind of get some of that hands-on expertise. For fire specific, there's the Michigan Prescribed Fire Council, and there's obviously the Lake States Fire Science Consortium for questions and events and field trips and workshops too. Any other thoughts you have? I mean, other access for these private landowners?
Well, I think that Lisa Brush or other people on the line would have a better sense of that than I would.
Okay. Well, we'll see what Lisa types. So let's dive into some of these other questions that came up or comments. Amelia said she'd be interested in the framework once it's complete. Then we have Sarah saying, did you find increased quality of land management with landowner coordination versus individual management?
Yeah, and so that's a good question, and a question that a lot of people have an interest in. That was really beyond what we were able to do. We didn't evaluate the ecological or physical outcomes of land management in these coordinated arrangements. I think that would be really important to do, because there's a general assumption that cooperation results in better ecological outcomes. That's an assumption in the academic literature, but there's not a lot of research on that. So I think that would be a really important thing to do. At this point, we're really just working hard to first see if there is coordination going among landowners. I mean, we know it happens among public, institutional landowner agencies and tribes and things like that, and between private and public ownerships. But it was really hard. One big challenge is finding out, does it even happen between private landowners in any kind of systematic way, and then characterizing it and learning about what makes it happen or what constrains it. But I think that a next step could be, like, once we could get a large enough sample, basically, of cases of coordinated management, we might be able to explore some of those questions. I think it's a really important question.
Okay, yeah. And just for reference, and I'll see if I can't dig it out, but I know, especially down in Texas and the Southwest, there are landowners that are very coordinated with prescribed burning, but they may have more land base, more finances do it. But it'd be an interesting comparison.
Yeah, and I have heard about that in more non-forested environments where people are using prescribed burning for rangeland and things. That for sure happens. Yes, I was thinking more about like private individuals and families who own forest land in these two areas. It was a little bit hard to find out.
Yeah, and that's a good comparison, thinking about more the forested or very small ownership. Larry Mastic asked, did any of the landowner groups have a CWPP or equivalent to guide or inform them?
Yeah. So in Michigan, my understanding is there's only one CWPP, and I think that the cases definitely in some of the cases in the West and in the Lake States, those involved landowners in an area where there was a CWPP, but their coordination was not a formal activity that had been planned by the CWPP. That's my understanding.
Yep, I agree.
But fire-wise, there were a few groups who were had come together as a Firewise, initially come together within a Firewise group or were affiliated with a Firewise group. But again, we found, even though we called a lot of fire safe councils and Firewise contacts of Firewise communities, we did not find that coordinated management was a common thing in those communities.
Right. It's more thinking about protection.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so Lisa Brush typed up a variety here. And Lisa Brush is the executive director for the Stewardship Network based out of Michigan. She said in her experience, landowners engaged think a lot about safety, but also agreed that there's a chance to introduce another element of equipment sharing, and something that they may not immediately come to mind in the shared equipment. Important part of training that is geared to private landowners. Let's see, she said also points to the continued need for prescribed fire training geared to that audience. They may not necessarily need or be interested in the certification that comes from formal prescribed fire training or wildland fire training. But there's also a lot of potential for ecosystem restoration the way that you're suggesting, Paige. Let's see. Bill has asked, has any of the groups considered Chipper Day program? And he says that the program recycles all woody materials for biomass and sent to a regeneration plant to create energy for local paper producers and helps to reduce the amount of prescribed burns.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, these Chipper Days are a great idea. And in two of the cases, landowners participated in the Chipper Days program, though, of course, not in many cases with the Chipper Days, even though that is a community effort to have, I guess all Chipper Days may be different, but to have somebody come to take away chips or to process them, that may be a community decision to make that happen. Landowners aren't necessarily coordinating the planning of how they're going to thin their land or chip, trees on their land. So in two of the cases, landowners actually were moving around a chipper on each other's properties and working together to chip. And so we considered that a case of coordinated management, though we did find out about other cases where landowners were chipping on their own land and then bringing it to a common location as part of a Chipper Days. And we didn't look at those as examples of coordinated management because they weren't actually jointly planning or implementing the actual chipping on their properties. So a little bit of a fine distinction, but yeah, those are, I'm glad Bill mentioned the Chipper Days because those are really important opportunities to mobilize people in communities.
Okay, good. I actually did get an email. I looked at it quick, and it was referencing equipment sharing or access to equipment that may come through local fire departments. So, private landowners that form a coordinated group could check with their local fire department to see if they could help participate, especially thinking about prescribed burns or sharing of equipment. And many of these local fire departments can apply. There's yearly grants, and there's a fair bit of money involved, where they can apply for money to outfit themselves with wildland fire gear rather than structural fire gear. That's another opportunity that coordinated landowners can think about, is working with their local fire department, and maybe getting the money that goes to the local fire department, but then that equipment is available to all, including the fire department.
Yeah, and I should mention that we came across a lot of examples, and I was already aware of examples of coordination among landowners around preparing for wildfire response. Definitely, that seems to be quite common and successful. And in terms of the cases that we were looking at, we were really looking at landowners who are coordinating around, managing the vegetation on their properties. So thinning to prevent fires as opposed to responding to fires. So, but still, that's an interesting point that I don't know. I mean, so I had students also involved in this research, so one of them may have come across something like this, but I haven't. And what I'm referring to is landowners working with their local fire departments to coordinate on the actual, like, using equipment or prescribed burning expertise to manage the vegetation in a jointly planned or jointly implemented way. That may happen, but I don't know if one of our cases was doing that.
Okay. And I have one more question that actually came through an email on the chat box. I remind people we're going to be wrapping up here, but please, if you have additional questions, type them in the chat box. The question was if you noticed anything significant, Paige, between areas or regions. So, the Midwest or Michigan versus Oregon or California, where you kind of highlighted you're finishing up some of the research.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, so we haven't really gotten that far really comparing, contrasting across the regions, but one of my hypotheses going into this was that risk would be a really important factor in whether people coordinated, and that we might find more examples of coordination in areas where people perceived greater risks from, like, not coordinating. So in fire-prone landscapes where fire moves across landscapes irrespective of property boundaries, or in areas where there were really heavy infestations of invasive plants that were causing economic losses. So I was expecting that people in those situations, we might find evidence that to support that people in those situations might be more likely to coordinate. But so far I don't feel like that's been the case. I do feel like a lot of the examples are in fire-prone contexts, but it hasn't been that much harder to find cases of coordinated management here in the upper Midwest than the U.S., the Pacific Northwest, where fire, the risk of large and very economically costly fires is arguably much greater.
Okay.
So that's the only thing I'm kind of interested in exploring. I can't say I found anything definitively yet, but the difference is not as great as I thought it would be. What I found so far is that the difference between the regions is not as great as I thought it would be.
Okay. We did one more question come in. Lisa Brush asked, as a follow-up to the trends region, have you noticed any trends over time? Are you finding more examples of this now, or do you see cross-funding collaboration declining?
That's not really something we're looking at. It'll be interesting. We definitely have in trying to find cases in Wisconsin, we definitely heard a lot about the history of the cooperatives, the forest cooperatives in Wisconsin. And one of the cases we investigated in Wisconsin was a group of people that originally knew each other, because they had been involved in one of the forestry cooperatives. So, and we found some cases that of past cooperation in Wisconsin. So where landowners aren't coordinating anymore. So that it doesn't really say anything about kind of the trends over time. But in a place like Wisconsin, it seemed like there was a big movement among landowners to cooperate more on maybe processing and marketing. And so maybe in Wisconsin, maybe there's less now. But I didn't really hear that anywhere else, that people were recalling days where there were periods of time in the past where people coordinated more.
All right. Well, I don't see any more questions coming in, so we will go ahead and wrap this up. But you had a lot of great questions. To highlight here, the last screen we have up, so our next webinar will be November 17th. It's the restoration of fire-dependent crane-bearing ecosystems in northern Wisconsin, bridging the gap between research and management practices. It'll be by Brian Sturdivant and Crystal Kern. They both work at the Northern Research Station, but what it's highlighting also is this, both Brian and Crystal received intern funding from the Lake States, and that was that they could hire intern to help the summer with data collection and other parts of the project. So they're going to be kind of showing how they're involved in an intern and research project and that collaboration between research and managers. Let's see, we did have, we're getting thank yous coming in. So again, Paige, I'd like to thank you and everyone online for joining us this afternoon. If anybody would like to review this webinar or share it with someone that might be interested but missed it, I will get a recording of the webinar up on the Lake States Fire Science website later this afternoon, and also be transferring it to YouTube. So with that, thank you very much, Paige, and everyone for participating. When I close this out, make sure you take a look at this. There will be an evaluation screen that should pop up, and I encourage everybody to please take that evaluation survey. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Well, thank you, and also I wanted to just mention that I'm going to type my email address, and I really welcome any feedback and questions, and if anybody would like to be on an email list that I'm maintaining to send out information, research updates about this project, I would be happy to add you. And of course, if you know of any cases of coordinated management that you think it would be good for us to investigate, please contact me with that information. But thank you very much for having me.
And that's excellent, Paige. So if you could send me that information too, I will make sure, I'll let you type that in here and not close it out for a few minutes so people can get that.
Okay,
But
great.
then I will also get that information up on the web page because that'll stay archived so they'll be able to access the recorded webinar, a PDF version of this talk, and then any of your contact information or progress so that as you go through the research and have findings, we can keep posting it to the web page and kind of highlight that in future newsletters so people are aware to take a look at that.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you much. And
all right, take care.
See.
Bye.
Yep. Do you have your stuff typed up there, Paige?
Yep, I'm just going to press return. Oh, forgot my email address, but there we go. I'm doing that now.
I'll leave this open for like a minute and then close it out so people
Okay.
get the evaluation survey.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.